Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. I don't think there's anyone else out in the foyer, but I'm Grant Zazula. I'm the paleontologist with Government of Yukon, and I'm here on behalf of Lori Schrader from the Yukon Science Institute, and she gave me some speaking notes, and I will now present her speaking notes. First, we'd like to acknowledge that this lecture is taking place in the traditional territory of the Kwanlun First Nation and the Ta'an-Kwachan Council, and also let you know that tonight's lecture is being recorded. So if you have a problem with being recorded, I guess we have to leave. But that's okay. It's live streaming. There's going to be the Kardashians are live tweeting, so it's going to be all over. It's going to break the internet, as they say in California. Tonight's lecture is being presented by the Yukon Science Institute. The YSI Institute is a nonprofit organization that seeks to promote public awareness in science activities in the Yukon and to aid and facilitate scientific research and development. As part of our mandate, YSI coordinates the lecture series that this lecture is a part of. YSI is funded by the Yukon Department of Tourism and Culture, Heritage Branch. Hey, those guys are cool. Supported by the Yukon Beringia Interpretive Center. The upcoming lectures include Daphne Buxbaum talking about how dogs know what they know on February 17th in Whitehorse and on February 18th in Dawson. Paul Galpern speaking about native bee conservation on February 14th. Bee conservation on Valentine's Day. So if you're looking for a date, you can come talk about bees and maybe birds too. In Whitehorse on February 15th in Haines Junction, and Stephen Chastain will be speaking about microplastics in the Arctic waters and their effect on marine life in the Arctic on March 1st. He will be the keynote speaker for the Yukon Biodiversity Forum taking place on Saturday, March 2nd. And before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to remind you that 2018-2019 memberships will be available at the membership table after the lecture if you haven't already purchased one. Please join. We'd really appreciate the support. And with it, you'll receive emails about upcoming lectures. Okay, so tonight's lecture is going to be presented by Eric Scott, and he will be discussing Ice Age horses of Western North America. And I'd just also like to say thank you to the Yukon Science Institute, because it's a bit self-serving that we brought Eric up here, because I also am interested in Ice Age horses. And we have lots of research to do on Ice Age horses, so the way I kind of generally do things with paleontology program is I invite people that actually know something to come often give a talk and then do some research with us. So as long, on top of the lecture, Eric's going to be working with us in the lab for the next 2 days, and hopefully we have a few answers to some of the complicated horse issues that we have in the Yukon, which are, really pressing and need to be addressed instantly. So Eric Scott is a vertebrate paleontologist, and he's a widely recognized specialist in extinct Pleistocene mammals, particularly horses and bison. He has published extensively on the evolution and extinction of Pleistocene megafauna with a focus on biogeography, particularly how the geographic distribution of species can change with time and changes in climate, and how this might better inform interpretations of observed extinction patterns. A Southern California native, Eric's studies have led him to conduct field and museum work throughout the U.S., as well as Canada, Mexico, and the Afar region of Eastern Africa. In 2017, he co-authored the first description of a new genus of Ice Age horse, Harrington Hippus francisci, based upon ancient DNA from fossil remains found in the Yukon and in southern Nevada. He's also responsible for discovering a second species of Pleistocene horse at the Rancho La Brea tar pits. Eric is a principal paleontologist for Cogstone Resource Management, Inc., a California-based consulting firm specializing in paleontology, as well as archaeology and history. He is also an adjunct in the Department of Biology at the California State University, San Bernardino. Eric is Emeritus Curator of Paleontology for the San Bernardino County Museum in Redlands, California, where he worked for 24 years, and a research associate with the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, California, or Los Angeles County and the La Brea Tar Pits Museum. He graduated from the University of California at Los Angeles in 1990, where he studies sexual dimorphism in colobus monkeys. He lives in Bloomington, California with his wife Kim, who is also a paleontologist, and he has no sense of humor. So with that, I'll invite Eric up here, and he can give his humorless lecture.
Thank you, Grant, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I have no idea how long this is going to take. Grant said take an hour and a half, take however much time you want, so this could drag on for quite some time, but hopefully you'll bear with me. Anyway, I'd like to speak with you tonight about horses from the ice ages of the American West. And horses are actually pretty iconic. You can envision them, especially if you're from the United States like I am. You can envision horses because that's where they live. You go out to the west, you go out to Monument Valley, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, and you can find feral horses living in those environments. And if you watch westerns on television or in the movies, horses, I still am having trouble thinking of a western that doesn't have at least one horse in it. Now, I've been told that the movie Rango, which was about an animated chameleon, as a cowboy, doesn't have horses in it, and so I guess grudgingly I'll give you that one. But for the most part, this is the sort of thing that you picture, and that even makes its way all the way up in here to Canada, where here too, horses are intimately associated with the perception of the frontier and of the West. In reality, horses have a very strong connection to the West, with Native American tribes having used horses successfully, and then as you move into historic periods, horses were essential to the development of civilizations and the local cultures that we have, both in the United States, here in Canada, down in Mexico, throughout North America, and many parts of the world. Horses are absolutely integral to that sort of thing. When I talk about Western horses, though, these are the animals I'm thinking of. This is the La Brea horse, and this is known as Equus occidentalis. That translates literally as Western horse, and this is the extinct Ice Age Western horse from the western part of North America. And this animal is very, very well represented at the La Brea tar pits, and that's important because the tar pits are the largest sample of Ice Age fossils known from anywhere in the world. They really are. There are over 4 million Ice Age fossils and counting from the La Brea tar pits. So when you say that horses are the second most common plant-eating animal from that deposit, that really hopefully conveys how abundant those animals were in that region during the Ice Ages, and technically throughout the Ice Ages in North America. And the reason I bring this up is because how many of you knew that about horses? Very few of you, and the reason is because these are the animals you're familiar with when you're talking about the Ice Ages. There are no horses in that picture, and this is unfortunate because when you talk about the Ice Ages and you look at the deserts of Southern California, inland Southern California, Southern Nevada, horses are common there as well. It's not just the La Brea tar pits, they are common throughout the Southwest, and they are common throughout the Great Plains region. And even here in the northern parts of North America, if you find Ice Age assemblages, you are almost certainly going to find horses in them. They're that common, they're that widespread. And it's not just the Ice Ages. Horses actually are common in North American fossil assemblages starting about 55 million years ago. Oh, thank you. Starting about I forgot where I was. I'll start over. Good evening. In any event, if you look through 55, 56 million years of geological time, you will see horses represented. And this is a lineage. I want to emphasize this because so much of what you see about horses in museums and online today, even Wikipedia, will show you a straight line evolutionary progression of horses from smaller to larger. And it absolutely was not that. It was a very bushy, branching relationship. Here's Equus, living Equus here. Our Ice Age horses are going to be there, but there were all sorts of side lineages over the past 55 million years. Sometimes making it into South America, sometimes making it to Asia and Europe and Africa. But here in North America, you can consistently find horses in fossil assemblages from about 55 million years ago all the way up until the Ice Ages. So this is an amazing North American success story that very few people hear about because people are focused on mammoths and saber-toothed cats and animals like that. It also surprises a lot of people who learned, as I did when I was a student, that the Spanish brought horses to North America, and that is a common perception. How many of you have heard of that? More than new horses were common in the ice ages. See how that works? It's a very prevalent idea. But as it turns out, the Spanish were not bringing horses to North America, they were returning them to North America. Horses got their start here on this continent. At least the earliest fossils that we know are horses are from North America. There are some earlier horse relatives that may be related to an ancestral form that are found on the Indian subcontinent, but in terms of what we would think of as horses, even primitive horses from 55 million years ago, they occur on the North American continent. And from this continent, they then moved out onto every other continent of the world except Antarctica and Australia. And you're probably wondering, how do they do that? Because horses aren't all that good at swimming. Well, this is what the Earth would look like today, but if you go back to the last major glaciation and you cover up most of the northern hemisphere with ice, all of this ice requires water, and when it takes this water, the sea level drops, and this land that is now the Bering Strait between Alaska and Siberia, that became dry land, and scientists even have a word for that dry land. They call it Beringia. And during periods of peak glaciation, when Beringia was above ground and dry, that enabled migrations to happen. So you had animals like bison and mammoths coming into North America from Asia, and you had horses leaving North America and entering into the Old World. And once horses made it into the Old World, they diversified. So when you think about zebras today, which most people will think of, you'll think of Africa. When you think of horses, when you think of donkeys and burros, all of those animals are descended from North American ancestors. All of them got their start here with the major horse lineage back during the ice ages and even before in North America. Once horses made it into the Old World, they became quite popular. In fact, in many areas, they start showing up in cave paintings, and in some cases, they are the most common cave paintings. So clearly, they were catching the attention of early people who were capable of painting them, usually, presumably, in a hunting context, where they weren't being ridden at this point. They were being simply hunted as food, as meat. But then, we had the appearance of what we would call domestication. And horses have a number of features that they share that enable them to be prime candidates for domestication. This is stuff that's been worked out by the biologist Jared Diamond, and he talks about their social structure and their demeanor and their ability to survive on relatively low quality foodstuffs and their ability to reproduce in captivity and so on. All of these make horses excellent candidates for domestication. And the same is true for just about all of the other domesticated animals you can think of. I will list cats as an exception because cats are always the exception. I think cats actually domesticated us rather than vice versa, but that is a completely different talk. There's different ways that you can domesticate organisms. When you think about wolves being domesticated, that was a pretty straightforward one, and this is known as, I should look here, the commensal pathway, and that's where you and the organism that's being domesticated share a relationship where you both have kind of similar goals. And when you think about us as hunting organisms and we're focused ahead and our eyes are forward and we're interested in meaty goodness, and wolves are the same way. Their eyes are forward and they are hunting animals. And so the thought there is that they are sharing a relationship, and as they were together in geographic proximity for hundreds or thousands of years, they eventually formed a relationship, kind of a partnership that resulted in the domestication that resulted in dogs today. There's also the prey pathway. This one's a little more straightforward. You see an animal, you want to eat it. You don't want to hunt it, so you start corralling it, you start domesticating it so that it is always there with you. It's readily available for consumption. So that's known as the prey pathway to domestication. You can think of sheep or cows or goats and so forth, all of being that sort of domestication. And then there's also what's known as the directed pathway, where you have animals that are domesticated for a specific purpose. You're not necessarily going to eat them, and you aren't necessarily partnering with them, but you can still put them to work for one specific purpose, and that's why those animals are domesticated. The procedure of domestication is going to change depending on how you want to do it, but it still involves selecting the organisms that are not quite so aggressive, controlling breeding, controlling access to breeding, providing food, controlling the food source, and so forth. So with that in mind, let's look at horses and think about where do horses fit in. Well, if you look at them, they've got their eyes on the side of their head. That means the horses are a prey animal. These are not hunting animals, these are prey animals. And so the thinking currently is that these animals started out as part of the prey pathway. And since we see the cave painting showing that the animals were being hunted, it makes perfect sense for this to be the entry form by which these animals were domesticated. It also turns out that horses are particularly good at surviving in more northerly climes where you have ice and snow. If you think about animals like sheep, they will sometimes dig through snow with their nose, and I'm talking about domestic sheep, not necessarily wild sheep, but they've been documented to dig through snow with their noses, and if they hit a hard rime of snow and they bruise or bloody their nose, they stop digging, and then they die. Cattle, you don't even bother wintering in snowy ranges. You bring them in because they can be standing on 10 centimeters of snow under which you have lots of grass, and the cows won't even dig with their noses or anything else. They will simply stand there and die because they're cows. Horses, on the other hand, will dig through the snow with their hooves. And they dig through the snow, they expose the grass, they eat it, and then they move on. And then other organisms can move in and eat the grass left behind in those exposed patches. And so horses are great for this environment. And so the thinking is that it started as a prey thing, particularly in the northern climes, and then as horses were being domesticated as prey animals, something like this happened. And we don't know when, and we don't know how, but at some point, somebody conceived the idea of riding on these animals. And it was a brilliant stroke because horses are actually really well put together for that sort of thing, anatomically. Horses are cecal digesters. That means they digest food in their intestines and their cecum. It's hindgut fermentation, and it's different from what cows do. If you're familiar with cows and other ruminants, or animals that chew the cud, they have multiple stomachs and they will process that food in their stomachs, and they will sit down and they'll chew cud all the time. And so, not to get too graphic, but if you look at a pile of cow flop, you will see that it is very, very thoroughly processed. Whereas horses digest stuff, they ferment stuff in their hind gut. And it's not necessarily as efficient as stomachs, but if it allows you to increase volume. That's why if you look at horse apples or horse poop, you'll see that it doesn't look nearly so well processed as what cows are producing. You can actually see the grain or the plant matter that the horse was consuming still preserved in their poop. And that's why horses, as cows will stand around for maybe 8 to 10 hours a day and spend a lot of time sitting down chewing their cud, horses will stand erect eating up to 18 hours a day. It is constant eating, constant flow through of that food. And because it's a hindgut fermentation system, they have enormous intestines and an enormous cecum. And if you can imagine walking around on all fours with great big heavy guts down here, they also have a heavily reinforced spine that helps hold up those heavy guts. And so evolutionarily, what you're looking at is an adaptation to being a hindgut fermenter and having a rigid, powerful back for holding up those heavy intestines, that huge mass of gut material. But it also means that they're great for riding on the other side, for sitting on top of the animals on their backs and riding them. And so, unlike cattle, unlike other large mammals, horses were particularly well suited to being ridden on their backs. And so that's how that sort of thing starts. So this is where it starts. And so you can see that we went from a prey pathway to a commensal pathway. It starts out as an animal that we want to eat because it's available, but suddenly there is a partnership there. Suddenly we are doing things together with these animals. So it's unusual among, I still think this is fascinating, it's unusual among plant-eating animals or prey animals to develop what is essentially a more dog-like relationship, where they're more of a partner in the work that's going on rather than simply a beast of burden or a beast of prey. The earliest archaeological evidence that we have for domestication takes place here at a site in Kazakhstan called the Botai site. And what they have there is, number one, an awful lot of horse bones. What they also have is what appears to be layer after layer in the sediment of tamped down fecal matter and other evidence that the horses were being corralled. They were being restricted in a pen. They also find bones that have bit wear, wear on the front of the teeth from where the bit would rest on the teeth. And so they show that showing up on some of these jaws. And they also have ceramic vessels that have mare's milk on the inside. And that's, again, think about trying to milk a wild horse. I would not recommend it. Think about it, don't try it. But if you think about domestic horses, that would be a great source for protein. That would be a great source for a lot of good fatty material. And so these are all arguments that Bowtie is the site where horses were domesticated. One of the earliest sites known, in fact, the earliest site, I believe, archaeologically, where horses were domesticated. That being said, this is a paper that came out just last year, just in 2018, that did a genetic study of the horses from Bowtie and compared those horses to domestic horses living today. And what they determined was that the Bowtie sample and Przewalski's horses that you see here were all in this lineage here, and that it had nothing to do with this lineage here that includes living domestic horses and historic domestic horses. And so even though Bowtie shows clear indications of horses being domesticated, that domestic lineage does not seem to have had any genetic contribution to living domestic horses, which suggests that horses were domesticated more than once, which is fascinating. It means they really did offer themselves as an opportunity to provide not only meat, but also provide partnership in the commensal pathway. What I want to emphasize is, again, you have the Bowtie horses here, and you have Przewalski's horses here. How many of you have heard of Przewalski's horses? Yeah. What's the common term for them? They're called wild horses, and most of you, in fact, I'll bet just about all of you, myself included, have read that these are the only true wild horses on planet Earth. Guess what? They're feral. They're descended from the animals at Bowtie. They are not wild at all, which means there are no true wild horses anywhere on Earth. They went extinct. And these are I'm not saying they aren't important. I'm not saying we shouldn't work to preserve Przewalski's horses, but we have to understand them in context. And based on the available genetic data, these are descended from domesticated animals, which means by definition, they are feral animals. Which means we don't know where domestication started. It was originally suggested to be somewhere around Bowtie in northern Kazakhstan, and now there are all sorts of other different sites that have been suggested as potential candidates, and we don't know where those are. Many of them up north where it's cold, where the idea of domesticating these animals because of their survivability in cold weather makes perfect sense. Some not so much. There's also the fact that this area here has people who have been genetically tested, and they show a connection with these people over here. Both of these cultures have produced horses, and genetically they are related among the actual people, the humans, and they appear to have bypassed the Bowtie people completely. So once again, I'm not suggesting necessarily that this is where horses first were domesticated, but horses were domesticated here, and we have a genetic link between those people that leaves the Bowtie population out. So this is still an open question as to where horse domestication that led to today's domestication actually got its start. So when we think we know everything there is to know about horses, this is still cutting edge. These papers were published in 2018, so this is relatively new material. And so it's quite exciting that these studies are going on. Once horses got to the old world, though, they went gangbusters, particularly after they were domesticated, whether they were being ridden or whether they were being used to draw chariots. And if you see things like the King Tut exhibits and other exhibits, horses were also used to pull chariots. But again, you had that domestication leading to a partnership with horses. And you can think horses in warfare, in commerce, in agriculture, in transportation, just about any aspect of human civilization, horses have played an integral part. This is something that has been noted by people for many years. Wherever man has left his footprint, in the long ascent from barbarism to civilization, we find the hoofprint of the horse beside it. No other animal has that distinction, not even dogs. Our Western civilization and all of the earlier civilizations upon which our civilization is based are built upon the shoulders of horses. And no other animal can lay claim to that. Not cows, not dogs, none of them. Horses are the most critical animal to our very way of life, at least in terms of how it became our way of life. You may be thinking of this as an old world phenomenon because I just talked about how horses made it into the old world and revolutionized human cultures and led to the development of human civilizations, whereas in North America, horses went extinct at the end of the ice ages. They didn't make it here. They didn't lead to major cultures here. And so that you might think of this as an old world story and start having the perception that maybe horses were not all that successful. Maybe horses died out in North America, and the reason they survived in the old world is because of their partnership with people. And if we hadn't domesticated them, maybe they wouldn't have made it. And that is a very interesting philosophical point and could be an avenue for scientific investigation, but I would respectfully suggest that you not mention it around zebras. Because if zebra hearing that is going to dismiss it out of hand and say piffle and poppycock and pafooey, but they won't say nay. They get worse from here on out, folks. Anyway, the point being, zebras, their ancestors are in North America, but they made it into the old world, and they made it across Asia, across Europe, into Africa, and established themselves. The earliest confirmed evidence we have of zebras in Africa is at 2.3 million years ago, long before they had any involvement with people. And they didn't just make it to Africa. They didn't just show up there. They took over the ecosystem. For those of you who have read about the Serengeti ecosystem and other wildlife ecosystems in Africa, it is the zebras who arrive at the food first. They eat the tall dry grass. Then the wildebeest and other medium-sized bovids come in. They eat the mid-range stuff, and then your gazelles come in at the end, and they eat the dainty little stuff down by the ground. That is the grazing succession. And that entire succession, the success of all of those organisms in Africa depends upon an immigrant from North America. You don't think of North America when you think of zebras, but maybe you should, because these animals descended from zebra-like forms that appear in North America 3.5, 4 million years ago, and then left the continent without any help from people and managed to dominate entire ecosystems on faraway continents. That is an amazingly successful story for this North American native. Horses are still important in many cultures, actually, literally, physically. Cultures depend upon them to conduct their day-to-day business in many parts of the world. Here in North America, we have a slightly different relationship. We don't depend on horses quite so much. We use them more for sport or for adventure or for entertainment or just for enjoyment, really. Although some of the things that we ask horses to do are actually kind of silly. And maybe should be avoided. We should maybe treat our animals with more. That is a monster horse. I love this picture. That is just a ginormous horse. That is a normal-sized woman. And that is, I believe that horse's name is Big John. And he's worth every inch of it. All of those horses and all of those relationships got their start with Ice Age animals. Animals that were adapted to winter conditions. Because that adaptation to winter conditions is what led to those animals being domesticated. And so if you want animals like horses to be adapted to winter conditions, you need two things. I'll give you the first one. You need horses. What's the other one? Winter conditions, absolutely. You need winter conditions. You need snow. You need ice. You need ice ages. And it was the onset of the ice ages around 2.6 million years ago in a sequence that led horses to develop those adaptations that in turn led us to be able to domesticate them and then form the civilizations and the cultures that we know and enjoy today. And so I would argue, of all of the Ice Age animals, and in fact all of the fossils out there, no other animal is more significant and more important to study than Ice Age horses. So suck it, Tyrannosaurus. We're just not going to go there. We're going to stick with Ice Age horses. And the story of Ice Age horses in North America started actually in South America. And it started back in the 1830s with that tooth. This is the first fossil horse discovered in the Americas that was recognized as a fossil horse. Prior to this discovery, horses were thought of as old world animals, and their evolutionary history was interpreted, actually, I should just say their history, because when this was discovered, evolution wasn't understood yet, hadn't been discovered yet, hadn't been figured out. But it was clear that horses lived in the old world, and so nobody expected to find them in the new world. But this was found in South America with sloth bones and with other South American fossil forms. And it was the first time it was recognized that horses were present in the Americas during the Ice Ages. And the person who found this tooth was Charles Darwin, of all people, when he was sailing around the world in the Beagle. So what a great, how cool is that, that Darwin was the first one to find this stuff. However, he had no idea what he was looking at. Literally, he said, I have no idea why this tooth is here. It's stuck in with these ground sloths, but it shouldn't be here because horses don't belong here. And so he sent it back to England, and it was Richard Owen at the Natural History Museum who said, oh, well, clearly it is an Ice Age horse. And even named it. He gave it a name, Equus curvidens, which means the horse with the curved tooth. Not terribly original, but it was the earliest known horse species named for the Americas. And it was named in 1845 by Richard Owen. After that tooth was discovered, scientists continued to find more and more and more teeth and partial jaws in North America. And because it was the 1800s, they did what scientists do, and they started naming species. To the point where today, if you were to look at the history of horse naming, I'm not saying there were this many species out there, but this is how many species have been named from North America. There's over 60 species named here. And a large part of the reason is because of the people who were naming them. You've got Joseph Leidy, who found several species. You've got Edward Drinker Cope, and you've got Othniel C. Marsh. Some of you may have heard of all of them. A lot of you may have heard of Cope and Marsh. Anybody? No dinosaur fans? Because if you've ever heard of the Bone Wars, it was Cope and Marsh. And they were competing with each other about dinosaurs. Each was trying to discover more fossils than the other. Each was trying to name more species of dinosaur than the other. Each would sometimes falsify their records so the other didn't know what they were finding. Sometimes they'd try to steal each other's fossils. Sometimes they'd destroy sites behind them so that nobody else could come in and find stuff after them. It was really pretty serious. And usually, because dinosaurs are so popular, that's the part of the story you hear. But you also had them doing this with horses. And what they essentially did was weaponize taxonomy, because Cope hated Marsh. And Marsh hated Cope, and the two of them fought for years. They fought so hard, and it became so acrimonious that Leidy eventually said, I'm out. I'm not going to do paleontology anymore. He went into bone biochemistry. In fact, I think he actually is the first person to use a microscope to solve a murder, where I believe there was, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a bloody knife, and the accused said, I used it to kill chickens, my chickens. And apparently chicken blood and human blood looks different, and Leidy's the guy who used a microscope to determine that it was human blood, the guy was a murderer, and the guy went to jail. So Leidy was done with paleontology, though, because it got so fierce. And Cope and Marsh did move on to dinosaurs, and eventually their feud ended, but by the time it ended, the damage had been done. All of these in red are the species that were named by just those three individuals. Over a third of the 60 species that we have on the books today were named by just those three, and a lot of that was because they were weaponizing taxonomy, because they were using the scientific naming process to attack each other. And so it was, we try not to do that as scientists anymore. We try not to name species unless there's a reason for it. But because of what's known as the rule of priority, where you have to deal with these things, and the first person to name something, that's the name that sticks. These names are still on the books, and you still have to deal with them on a regular basis. However, after that period of time, we continue to find horse remains, and they became increasingly complete. This is a skeleton, a complete skeleton of a horse from Rancho La Brea. Granted, it is a composite skeleton made up of really pretty bones from multiple individuals. Nevertheless, they have so many bones at La Brea that they can put together skeletons like this. You also had beautiful skulls like this one from right up here in the Yukon, from Gold Run Creek. This is actually the holotype skull and jaw of a species known as Equus lambi, which some of you may have heard of. And this is at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. It was found in 1903, and I believe it was named in 1917. But nevertheless, this is the holotype specimen, perfectly preserved. We'll talk about why in a few minutes, but beautifully preserved, and fossils like this, even back in the early 1900s, were coming out of this region and going into museums in the United States as well as elsewhere in Canada. Because we have so much material, you can look at the anatomical features of these animals and you can break them into groups. So you can look at whether their teeth are primitive or derived. You can look at whether their foot bones are short and squat or long and skinny. You can look at their lower teeth to determine, do they have these little enamel cups in them, or do they have these smooth spatula-shaped lower teeth? And if you do all of that, you can come up with a breakout like this, where you can look at the number of potential species there, and you can key them out by body size, by whether their teeth are primitive or derived, by the shape of their foot bones, and the presence and absence of cups in their lower incisors. And so that gives you an idea that there's several different horse species running around North America, at least based upon the available paleontological and anatomical evidence. What's more, you can actually, once you've determined how many species you think you have, you can break them out by time period. So you can see which ones occur early in the horse lineage, which ones occur in the middle of the Pleistocene, and which ones were still around at the end of the Pleistocene, where in North America all of these animals went extinct. What I'd like to do is look at a couple. And again, even though I'm here in the Yukon and was invited by the Yukon, because I am a Southern California paleontologist, what I'd like to do is focus a little bit for now on some of the fossils that I've been working with, just so you can kind of see the sorts of patterns that I'm dealing with when I'm looking at these animals. So let's return to the extinct western horse from Rancho La Brea. And this species is a large species with short, fat limbs and no cups in its lower incisors and derived teeth. And so there's a suite of characteristics you can use to identify this animal. And you can also look for it in other sites. So here's where this horse shows up at Rancho La Brea, at Diamond Valley Lake, all the way out here, potentially in New Mexico, and then up in the McKittrick and Maricopa area, where there are also more tar pits, and those have produced horse fossils. If you get outside of this range, that's Equus occidentalis. If you get outside of that range, there is a second species known as Equus scotti. It is a big animal with short, stout limbs and derived teeth, but it does have those enamel cups in its lower teeth. And so you can tell the two organisms apart. There's the cups in Equus scotti, there's the lack of cups in Equus occidentalis, and you can see that scotti occurs all throughout western North America, except down here in the southwestern part, like Southern California and maybe into New Mexico. This is interesting because this is the picture at the end of the ice ages. If you go back earlier to the middle of the ice ages, it's all Equus scotti, all over western North America, even in Southern California, even in some of the same places where later we find Equus occidentalis. And so clearly, you move from this, let's say 700,000, a million years ago, to something like this picture, where now, this is to show you that you have the enamel cups in these animals. And then you move back to something like this by the end of the ice ages. Now, I don't know if that is an evolutionary spurt in the appearance of a new species, or if that is a migration of a species from outside of the area into Southern California and parts of New Mexico. Don't know that yet. We would need genetic information from the La Brea horse, which we don't currently have. Nevertheless, something happened there because the anatomy changes and it's distinctive and you can't miss it. I don't want to overpaint this picture, though. This is zooming in on just the American Southwest where I work. This is mainly the Mojave Desert, and all of these localities are localities that have produced horse remains, but not all of them have produced remains that can be identified as species. If you just look at the sites that have produced animals that can be identified as species, there's only maybe 4 that have been published. All the rest of these have horse teeth or horse bones or horse something, but they don't have the right bits to be able to determine what species they are. We can say it's big, we can say it's little, but that's as far as we can take it. So what happens when you find something like this? This is a skull from San Juan Capistrano. This is a fossil skull from San Juan Capistrano. And this is found on a construction site, and this is what my company does. Cogstone Resource Management goes out on construction sites, and as excavation is conducted, we find fossils and recover them. This is actually required by California state law. You have to preserve the fossils and the archaeological remains if they are found in a construction context. And then all of those fossils are preserved, their contextual data are recorded, and then the fossils will end up in a museum. That's required by California law. And so that's what we do. It's called paleontological mitigation. And sometimes you find spectacular things like mammoths, and you put them in plaster jackets and off they go to museums. And we recently on the the Los Angeles subway found that juvenile mammoth skull, 6 or 7 years old at the time the animal died. This is 40 feet below the surface at La Brea in Wilshire. So when they're digging, they're finding fossils even if it's not the tar pits. How cool is that? We also find horses. That is a fossil horse tooth from the LA subway. What species is it? I am the foggiest horse expert, right? But I don't know because I don't have the lower teeth, I don't have the foot bones, and there's not a lot I can say. It was a big horse. That's a derived tooth pattern. That's as far as I could take it. So that's frequently what you have to deal with in the mitigation game in California, is dealing with fragmentary remains. So finding a complete skull is a reason for celebration. So we didn't know if this skull was Equus occidentalis or Equus scotti. So I was working with a young lady named Marie Kuchar. She and I were working at a place called the John D. Cooper Center, and we studied this fossil and measured it and compared it, and we still couldn't figure it out. We still didn't know, is this Equus occidentalis or is it Equus scotti? Because of the preservation, because of the size, we knew it was one or the other of those, but we couldn't take it any further. However, it turns out there was also a lower jaw that we found in the collections that hadn't been noted previously. And when you look at that, you can see that its lower teeth do not have those enamel cups. They're these flat spatula-like teeth, just like what you see at the La Brea horse, not at all what you see in Equus scotti. So this is Equus occidentalis from San Juan Capistrano, and it's the first record of that horse from San Juan Capistrano and from anywhere in Orange County, California. So if you have the right bits, this is the sort of work you can do. If you move outside of there, so let's add San Juan Capistrano down there. If you move outside of Southern California, though, maybe out to the Mojave Desert, let's go up here to a site just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada, called Tule Springs. How many of you have been to Las Vegas? More of you need to get out. It is warm down there right now. Though it is quite warm up here now. It's beautiful weather. I hope you all have a chance to get out today. Anyway, a lot of people, when you go to Las Vegas, this is what you see, but when paleontologists go to Las Vegas, this is what you see. This is actually North Las Vegas, and this is the Upper Las Vegas Wash. And this is right outside of Las Vegas. And this is what the sediments look like, and almost nobody knows that this stuff is here. And yet, if you know where to look, there's bones. There's fossil bones of Ice Age animals. You've got mammoths, you've got camels, you've got horses, you've got bison. You've got so many fossils there, and the geology preserving those organisms is so unique and so informative that in 2014, this area was designated a national monument. It's one of the most recent national monuments that recently reopened because the U.S. shutdown is over, thankfully. Nevertheless, it's pretty cool to have an Ice Age monument named specifically for the fossils. It's not just Tule Springs Monument, it's Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument. And horses are known from this monument. There's one of them. Trying not to get too worked up. Grant is smiling down here because he has fossils preserved in permafrost. This is a lot of what scientists in California and Nevada deal with. That is a fossil tooth fragment. It's enough for me to tell you that a horse was there. That's as far as I can take it. And for decades, over 100 years of work in Las Vegas, that's the kind of horse that was being found, is just fragmentary bones and teeth and not enough to really lock in on what species this is. That all changed in 2012 with this excavation at Tule Springs conducted by volunteers where they unearthed this fragment of horse jaw. How cool is that? We were actually out there to dig up a mammoth. There's a mammoth tooth there. There's a mammoth tusk there. There's probably an entire skull below the surface. But we stopped because we found a horse, and as I've already told you, horses are cooler than mammoths. It turns out we had a lower jaw and a partial skull, and if you look at the lower jaw, you've got those enamel cups, which you didn't have in the San Juan Capistrano horse, which you don't have with the La Brea horse. And so this is a different species, at least as far as we can tell. And so if you key this one out, this would be Equus scotti. How cool is that? For the first time in over 100 years of work at Tule Springs, now we can actually put a name on this animal. And so this is a different animal from what you see in Southern California and the more coastal regions. And this is consistent with the pattern that you see if you look at Western North America as a whole, with the San Juan Capistrano horse fitting in perfectly there, and the Equus scotti from Las Vegas fitting in perfectly there. So paleontologically, it looks like you've got a nice tight picture, and you're starting to look at how species are divvying up the North American continent. It's very, very exciting. What I'd like to note, though, is that in addition to the large horse from Las Vegas, there are smaller horses. This is a phalanx, or a finger or toe bone. And if you look here, here are all of these smaller horses, the stilt-legged ones, the stout-legged ones, all of them lumped together. This one falls in there with the stout-legged horses. So it's a small stout-legged horse based on this fossil. We also think we have stilt-legged horses based on this fossil. Granted, this is not complete. I'll come back to this point in a minute, if I remember. Nevertheless, it looks like we have 3 species of horse just from Las Vegas. A big one, a little one with stout legs, and a little one with skinny legs. And then if you add in the La Brea horse as a different species of large horse, it means just in the Southwest, we potentially had 4 species of Ice Age horse living at about the same time. That is an amazing diversity of horses and is very exciting paleontologically. It also may be entirely wrong, because work has been going on by genetic scientists studying the genomes of these animals, and they have published multiple papers suggesting that there were no more than 2 species of Ice Age horse in North America during the Ice Ages. And they do this based on DNA preserved not only in living horses, but also in fossil horses. And so they're studying, the early studies were based on mitochondrial DNA, and more recent studies, more complete with a much bigger amount of data, have been produced by studies of DNA from the nucleus itself, or nuclear DNA. And so these studies have been used to suggest that there may have been no more than 2 species of these animals alive at one time. This is a paper from 2005, and this is actually using mitochondrial DNA, and what you can see is that you've got Przewalski's horses. Keep in mind we're talking about feral descendants of the bowtie horses, but they're still the same species as living horses. It's just that they are a different population. So don't get lost in that. I'm not talking about different species. They're a separate population, but look where they plot relative to domestic horses, living domestic horses. Przewalski's horses fall right in that group where they're surrounded on either side. What you also might see are these animals in that same branch, that A branch. And these come from Alaska and the Yukon. And very closely related are these animals here. These are horses from Alaska and the Yukon. I really want to emphasize that. These are all your fossils. These are all stuff from your backyard, oh Canada, and all of your provinces. This is where the cool fossils, this is where the genetic studies are being driven, is right here under your feet and in your backyard. And the reason that that's happening here, as you probably know, is because of a phenomenon known as permafrost. And it's throughout this region, it's all over the place, and as it melts due to ongoing global warming, and as it also is exposed due to mining and other activities, you start finding fossils. And these are fossils that have been frozen since the ice ages, and in many cases still are. And so because of that preservation, they retain their DNA. And so you have beautiful fossils being produced. That's a horse foot. With the skin, the flesh, all of it is there, and has been since the ice ages. Tens of thousands of years, and that bone is just, that leg is looking fantastic. And so this offers an unparalleled opportunity to study the genetics of these animals. And that work has been going on for quite some time by Grant Zazula, who's been working on horses and bison and any number of animals. You've got Ross McPhee from the American Museum of Natural History. You've got Beth Shapiro and her team from UC Santa Cruz in California. all of them looking at the DNA of these organisms and trying to find out what the relationships are based on genetics rather than based on interpretations of anatomical configurations and morphology. So when you look at this, this is a mitochondrial study that suggested that there were no more than 2 species of Ice Age horse. Everything I showed you based on the anatomy would have to be wrong in that case. There wouldn't be 10 or 11 different species. There would only be 2 based on mitochondrial DNA. You'll also see, mixed in with the Yukon, mixed in with Alaska, are some stuff from a little closer to my backyard, from Wyoming. We don't have permafrost in Wyoming. Well, they don't. I'm not from Wyoming, so I shouldn't say we. But folks in Wyoming don't have permafrost. But what they do have is this cave, known as Natural Trap Cave. I don't know how many of you may have heard of it, but this is an Ice Age trap. This is the cave. It's horizontally situated, so you can imagine horses and other animals running along here, and down they plummet. It's a trap. Oh, sorry. Try that again. There we go. I hit the wrong button. I apologize. This is what the cave looks when you're down in the bottom. And that is a 26-meter plummet. And so the animals are running along, minding their own business, or trying to escape from a predator, and suddenly they hit that hole, they slam on the brakes, and they skid right over the lip, and they plummet down 26 meters and die pretty horribly. And that happened for thousands upon thousands of years, and an increasingly large pile of bones built up at the bottom of this deposit, 26 meters down. Now, the reason I bring that up is that if you were at the top of that cave in the sun in summer, it can be 35 degrees, 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. If you were in the bottom, it's around 3 degrees Celsius. This bottom, this cave, is a pocket of the ice ages that never thawed. It's not permafrost sitting at the surface, but it is still very chilly down there. You have to wear jackets, you have to wear gloves. It can be very cold. And as a consequence, what you see up here in the permafrost is the same thing that you see at the bottom of Natural Trap Cave. You have horse fossils like this one, and like this hoof, and like this toe bone, and like this tooth. And so these fossils were originally excavated in the 70s, and then they were excavated again a few years ago when a paleontologist named Julie Meechan reopened the cave, and apparently she is reopening the cave again this summer. So there will be more pictures of paleontologists rappelling down to collect horse fossils, and hopefully I don't lose bladder control when I'm rappelling. But never mind, you didn't hear me say that. We're live streaming, aren't we? Some of the fossils actually recovered here also produced DNA, like the stuff from the permafrost. And so we're able to relate these horses to the ones that we're finding up here in the Yukon and in Alaska. And this is kind of critical because in those early excavations in the 1970s, horse fossils were found there as well. And so the published papers suggest that there were 3 species just in this one cave. Other studies suggest that there were 4 species just in this one cave. And one paper suggests that there were 5 different species of horse just in this one cave. And yet, if you look at the foot bones and you measure them, and here are your stout-legged bones and here are your stilt-legged horses, you can see that you've got a cluster from Natural Trap Cave that are stilt-legged and a cluster from Natural Trap Cave that are stout-legged, and that's all you have. So the anatomy looked at correctly suggests no more than 2 species here, which is exactly what the genetics are telling you. And so this is why I tend to think that some of what we're looking at anatomically is actually sending a usable signal. We still need to tease that out, and I still have more to talk about, but nevertheless, in some instances, I think that what's being found with the genomic data and what's being found with the anatomical data are telling you the same thing. Now, moving further south, we don't have Ice Age pockets left in the American Southwest, and we certainly don't have permafrost. What we do have, though, outside of Tule Springs is this site called Gypsum Cave. And this is what it looks like today. This is Bureau of Land Management land. And this is a site that was excavated in the 1930s. And so there was a remarkable excavation to pull out. Look at all these horse fossils just sitting there in the bottom of this cave. They weren't interested in horses back then. They were interested in whether or not early people were there and whether they were hunting sloths and other animals in the region. And that's actually one of the drivers for studies of Ice Age animals throughout the Mojave Desert. It wasn't necessarily interest in the animals, it was interest in whether humans were there hunting them at the same time. There are no longer any fossils in Gypsum Cave. They've all been removed, but you can find them at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, which is in Los Angeles County, and here's what some of those bones look like. And if you look closely, you can see that this is all holding together. I did not put these bones together for this picture. They were found like this in the collection because these bones are being held together by ligaments and tendons. This is not frozen like in the Yukon or in Natural Trap Cave. This is mummified from the heat and aridity of the Nevada desert. And so it's a completely different process of preservation, and yet the end result is the same. These fossils also have DNA preserved in them. And so we were able to get DNA out of these fossils, and here you have your stout-legged horses and your stilt-legged horses, and the ones from Gypsum Cave plot right there. And the DNA says the same thing, that this is a stilt-legged horse from the Ice Ages. And it was about 13,500 years old when the animal died and started to be preserved in Gypsum Cave. So we're finding a consistent pattern of small stilt-legged horses and other horses in the Yukon and in Natural Trap Cave, and now as far south as Gypsum Cave in the southern tip of Nevada. So there seems to be a consistent pattern emerging both anatomically and genetically from these organisms. You can even see that they plot here. Here's the Yukon, here's Nevada, and here's Wyoming, and here's more Yukon. So all of these stilt-legged horses plotting together. This again is that 2005 paper, and at the time, not only was this relationship across a broad swath of North American geography recognized, but what was interesting is that these animals don't relate to these. Prior to this study, the interpretation was that North American stilt-legged horses from the Ice Ages were the same species as these guys. These are Keong from Mongolia and Tibet. These are living stilt-legged animals. And so it was assumed that these animals and the Ice Age ones from North America were related because they both have long, skinny limbs. It turns out that based on genetics, they have nothing to do with one another. One was an endemic North American species, the other is from Eurasia. So that was a fascinating discovery that you wouldn't have been able to resolve using just the anatomy of these animals. You needed the DNA preserved to get at that answer. Also from Gypsum Cave, we have this specimen, and again, I just love this stuff, that we can find fossils that look like this. That is a hoof. That is the phalanx, or the foot bone, preserved inside the hoof. And because I go to museums and measure bones, because this bone is exposed in the hoof, you're able to put calipers on it and you're able to plot it. And so here are all of your small horses, the stilt-legged ones, the stout-legged ones, all of them in a big clump. This one from Gypsum Cave plots up there. This is a large stilt-legged horse, large stout-legged horse. It's a big, fat, large horse. Because Gypsum Cave is so close to Nevada, I would argue that this is very likely Equus scotti. And if you remember earlier, I talked about the stilt-legged horses from Tule Springs and said, it's a juvenile animal, it's not well preserved, maybe there's some iffiness. Gypsum Cave is right there and has 11 individuals of stilt-legged horse. So we know that in that area, Las Vegas and Gypsum Cave, we had a big stout-legged horse and a small skinny-legged horse. We know that those organisms were there living near each other, if not intermingling with each other, during the Ice Ages. We also suspect that we may have had a third small stout-legged horse at Nevada, but we don't have anything like that from Gypsum Cave, and we don't have any DNA to back that up from Las Vegas. So that remains an open question. Nevertheless, you can kind of see how there is a consistent pattern appearing here. What's interesting about the large horse is that genetically, the large horses from North America, not the stilt-legged horses, but the big ones with the stout limbs, are genetically very similar to living horses. And the reason this is significant is because living horses, the domestic ones we all know and love, we keep at home, we feed them, we take care of them, but sometimes in human history in North America, some of those animals have escaped. and they have survived in the wild. And we refer to them as feral horses. And you have them here in Canada, and we have them in the United States. And in both areas, they are increasingly a management issue because the ice ages ended, and the natural predators that these animals had disappeared. And so when these horses get loose in the wild, they are able to breed and breed and breed using helicopters and fences, and then they will collect some of them, and then they will try to auction them off. And increasingly that program is not working, which has led to horse activists and others being concerned about how to manage these animals. It is a very, very thorny issue. I'm not going to try to resolve that issue here tonight. It's simply too much for me. I have enough trouble telling these animals apart. I don't need to try and figure out how to manage living organisms in the western part of the United States or in Canada. What I will say is that some people have suggested, both in papers and in legislation, at least in the United States, that because we have horses here during the ice ages, these animals are native. And the feral horses running around the western United States and running around Canada should be treated as native wildlife, not as introduced, not as feral, but as native animals. This is from 2009, so it's 10 years old. Nevertheless, this shows you how far that idea is gone, where bills are actually being introduced in the US Congress to designate these animals as wildlife so that they can be managed that way, the same way you would manage bison, the same way you would manage caribou or elk or any of those. I would argue that that maybe is premature, but it's based upon the interpretation that the species we see in the area during the ice ages is genetically more or less the same species that you see living here in the wild in parts of Western America. I want to go back to Gypsum Cave because when the study was published in 1933, there was a statement in the paper, the 1933 paper, that said there was a horse skull found. This is Christina Lutz, my partner. She's at the Yale Peabody Museum, and she and I were working on the Gypsum Cave horses, and we read that there was a skull, and we said, we just looked at every single fossil in the collection, and none of them was a skull. And so we mentioned this to the museum personnel there, and a collections manager named Vanessa Rue, looking through the collections, actually found the horse skull. This is it. Look how well preserved that is. It looks like last week's lunch. And it doesn't just look like that to me or to you, because it was in the modern osteology collection. Somehow it had gotten separated from the Gypsum Cave collection and put in the modern osteology collection, and somebody even wrote burro or wild ass in pencil across the top of this 13,500-year-old horse. That's how good the preservation is. And so finding it and having an animal that was identifiable in a complete, beautiful skull, we sampled it for DNA. And that DNA was submitted to Beth Shapiro's lab at UC Santa Cruz. And right there is Equus caballus, the living domestic horse, and New World caballine equus, like Equus scotti, for example, like the one we were talking about earlier. That's part of a larger group, which includes Keong, the stilt-legged animals, includes asses, includes zebras, both multiple different kinds of zebras. All of these animals are in Equus, living and extinct. The New World stilt-legged horses are here. They are a completely different lineage, and they separated out around 5 million years ago. We didn't expect that. This is based on nuclear DNA. So this didn't show up in earlier studies that were based on mitochondrial DNA, but this is a more complete genomic sample, and the indications are clear. This animal is distinct from all known Equus, at least based on the available genetics. And so based on that, it was determined to name a new genus, which we named Harrington hippus, and it was named in the end of 2017 with Beth Shapiro and Pete Heinzman, one of her students, and Grant Zazula, and a whole bunch of other people getting involved in the naming of this animal. But it's a new genus of Ice Age horse from North America, and it extends from Alaska and the Yukon all the way down through Wyoming and all the way down into southern Nevada. Probably even further. We're going to have to resolve that. It may make it down to Mexico, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Harrington hippus is named for Dick Harrington. who was a long-term curator of Canadian mammals here in Canada. So it seemed appropriate, given his lifetime of studying these horses, to designate this animal to be named for him. So if you don't think Canada is playing a role in horse evolution, you are gravely mistaken. It is it's revolutionizing. The fossils from your backyard are changing just about everything we thought we knew about these horses. Our study did not go unchallenged. There is another Canadian paleontologist, Christina Barron-Ortiz, who is looking at the horses, and she doesn't necessarily challenge the distinction of the stilt-legged horses, but she challenges our taxonomy and says that maybe this is just a different kind of equus. And that is a technical thing, and I do not want to get into this here because taxonomy is extraordinarily boring. What I do want to mention, though, is that as part of her study, her and her colleagues found stilt-legged horse DNA from a horse in Mexico that has stout feet. Just when you thought everything was making sense and there was a consistent picture, suddenly nothing makes sense. Because if a stout-legged horse can have stilt-legged horse DNA, it means you're not able necessarily to use the anatomy of these animals to figure them out. You need DNA. And most horse fossils don't give you DNA. And it kind of leaves you at a loss. This is the horse. This is the stout-legged horse from the Natural History Museum in LA County. It's called Equus conversidens. And this is the horse. We know it was stilt-legged because they've got stout-legged because they've got a huge sample of this animal from a cave in Mexico, San Josecito Cave. And yet one tooth yielded stilt-legged horse DNA. There's something going on. I would love to tell you that I've got it figured out. I don't. But what we do have, interestingly, is horses like the La Brea horse and like Equus scotta that may be the same species, even though they're anatomically distinct. And you can tell them, if you've got the right bits, you can tell them at a glance. What you also have is horses that look just like wild horses or wild burros. And yet their DNA suggests that they have been separated from the horse lineage for about 5 million years. None of that makes any sense. And so it suddenly leaves you with this really perplexing idea. And a horse paleontologist will find himself or herself simply wondering, how do I proceed? And were horses the right thing to do to begin with? Is this really what I wanted to stake my professional career on? And so it's very, very frustrating, but that's the way science works sometimes. Sometimes what we think is clear-cut isn't necessarily clear-cut. All we can do is keep doing what we're doing. Get DNA out of the fossils that we can get DNA out of, and study and measure the fossils that aren't likely to yield DNA. But what I also want to suggest is that the way we do science might actually be part of the problem. And it might go back to Leidy and Cope and Marsh and a lot of people from that time period, and the whole way naming organisms is set up, because what we are trying to do is take what we are observing and fit things into boxes. This species, that species. And I think what we're starting to really get a hold of with horses more than other animals, because horses are so common and because their fossils are so well represented, they're the lead animal where we are starting to see that maybe variation is the key. And maybe trying to define species that are changing across geography and changing through geologic time, maybe trying to fit them into categories is not the best way to approach it. Maybe instead of worrying about species names and species designations, we try to look at the broader patterns of changing in anatomical configuration, whether or not it means species. Now, that's not popular in paleontology because when you name a species, your name sticks to it. So if you want to be a paleontologist and have some sort of street cred, how many species have you named? How many species have you named? And that's one of the ways that scientists hallmark themselves and say, I've named 32 species. I've only named 2 genera. I haven't named any species at all that I'm aware of. So I'm a failure as a paleontologist. And I apologize, and you should apologize for asking me up here. But maybe the point isn't that we are trying to constrain species. Maybe the point is that these animals are evolutionarily fluid through time and across geography, and that we are still starting to tease out how they relate to each other. And that brings me back to the idea that these animals can be used to inform us about living feral horses, because these animals are not just part of an evolutionary continuum that changed through time and with geography. They're also animals that were integral parts of ecosystems, and they partitioned those ecosystems. They had predators that hunted them, they had other herbivores, and they divvied up the environment amongst themselves, and that entire ecosystem disappeared more than 10,000 years ago. And so reintroducing horses in the absence of their rest of their ecosystem isn't justifiable. Treating them as native wildlife isn't necessarily the correct approach. That's not the way you approach it. Instead, you treat them on your own terms. Talk to biologists, talk to wildlife people, talk to land managers, but paleontology is not appropriate because we're still learning about the horses themselves, and we do know that the ecosystem they were a part of is no longer with us. So maybe we should let feral horses be dealt with as their own issue without trying to use paleontological expertise to inform it. Nevertheless, next time you see horses, I really want you to consider how important they are to humans and how they have an amazing and long evolutionary history, and that the Ice Age horses are what led to the development of our civilization. So when you step out into the collections here, when you look at the mummified skin that is preserved here, when you look at the horse skeletons that are preserved here, keep in mind that the Ice Age horses are what led to us being the people who are here today and can enjoy the advantages of the Western civilization that we have lived in and that we continue to promote. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank you all very much for coming out this evening. I had a kick giving you this talk, and I hope you did too. And with that, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Thank you.